So the last video we talked about perfect competition and things that characterize perfectly competitive markets. And now we want to look at alternative market structures besides perfect competition. And the first one we want to look at is monopoly, which should be at least a familiar term. And monopoly is a firm that is the sole seller of a product, and that product can't have any close substitutes. And the key difference between monopoly and perfect competition is that a monopoly has market power, meaning that the monopoly can actually influence the market price. So, what we'd first like to know is, how do monopolies come to exist in the first place? And the answer is barriers to entry, meaning other firms can't or aren't able to enter the market. And typically, those barriers to entry are going to fall under two categories. One is going to be that a single firm owns a resource, a key resource, meaning that other firms who would like to enter that market just don't have access to that resource. So, an example is diamond mines. Most of the diamond mines in the world are owned by one company. So, if you'd like to enter the diamond market, you have to find a unclaimed diamond mine, which is a large barrier to entry. The second category is what I'm going to call government privilege. And those are going to be things that legally keep other firms from competing. So those could be patents or copyright laws, things of that nature. As long as there's something that keeps other firms competing with the monopoly. So let's look at the demand curve for a monopoly and see how that is different than a perfectly competitive firm's demand curve. So if you remember, the demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm is a horizontal line. And the reason was, remember that every other firm in a perfectly competitive market is selling a homogeneous product, the same product, and no firm has influence over the price. If this firm were to deviate on price up to P prime, no one would buy from that firm when they can buy the same product from a different firm at price P. And so we get a horizontal demand curve. However, the monopolist or the monopoly is the only seller in the market. And so their demand curve is going to be the same as the market demand curve. And market demand curves always slope downwards, right? The last slide I just showed you was the competitive firm's demand curve, but the market demand curve in a perfectly competitive firm is still downward sloping. So this is the monopoly's demand curve. And there's no other sellers to go to in this case. So if the monopolist raises the price, they don't lose all their customers to a different firm. And so the monopolist's demand curve is not horizontal. And so, in contrast to perfect competition, the marginal revenue is not equal to price in this case. So now what we'd like to know is since marginal revenue doesn't equal price, what is marginal revenue and how does it relate to the demand curve? So we know price does not equal marginal revenue, but now we'd like to know, how does marginal revenue relate to demand if it's not the same as demand? So here's an example. This is Jittery Joe's Coffee, and they are now the only seller of coffee in town. So we've got a monopoly coffee shop, and we've got various prices and the demand represented by the Q, the quantity demanded at various prices. And so we can fill in this chart in the standard way, just multiplying price times quantity to get total revenue. Average revenue, remember, is the total revenue divided by quantity. And you'll quickly notice that average revenue is equal to the price in this case, just like a competitive firm. And then finally, we can calculate marginal revenue, right? So that's going to be the change in total revenue between each additional unit of the good. So the first case, not applicable, we're not adding a unit. Then we add one, we get $4. On the second unit, we get an additional $3 to get 7, and so on. And as always, we can plot this and look at it. So here's our demand curve for the monopoly, or the market demand curve, the same thing, remember? And then we can plot the marginal revenue curve. And you'll notice marginal revenue is below demand. And remember, demand represents the price at a given quantity. And so this leads us to a general property of monopolies, which is that the marginal revenue is going to be less than price always. Whereas in the perfect competition case, marginal revenue was equal to price. So that's a key difference for the monopoly. So why is that? Well, when you increase the quantity, there's an output effect. As you increase the output that you're selling, you're going to raise revenues. But then there's a counteracting price effect. Whereas as output increases, the corresponding price is going to be lower, and those lower prices are going to negatively impact revenue. And so if the monopolist wants to sell a larger quantity, they have to reduce the price on all of the units they sell. So the only way that can happen is if marginal revenue is less than price. So now we want to talk about profit maximization. A monopoly, just like any type of firm, wants to maximize profit and find the profit maximizing price and quantity. And here, the profit maximizing quantity is going to be exactly the same as the competitive firm. It's going to be the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And once that profit maximizing quantity is found, then the monopolist is going to set the price such that it's the highest price consumers are willing to pay for that quantity that equates marginal revenue and marginal cost. So that's the difference between perfect competition. They get to set the price. So then the question is, how do you find that price? And the answer is going to be use the demand curve. Remember, the demand curve represents consumers' willingness to pay. So we've got our demand curve. We have our marginal revenue curve, which is below demand, and a marginal cost curve. So as I just described on the last slide, that quantity we're looking for is going to be where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So this is the profit maximizing quantity. And then we want to set the price that's the highest price consumers are willing to pay. And we just reference their willingness to pay, which is going to be the demand curve. And so to set the price, you go from this point up to the demand curve and then over to the y-axis. So this is going to be the profit maximizing price. And then we can also calculate the actual profit, but to do that, we need an average total cost curve. Remember, profits are calculated based on the average cost. And remember, average cost is usually going to be U-shaped, something like this. And to calculate the profit, it's going to be the difference between the price and the average total cost curve at the quantity. And then make a rectangle. So remember, this rectangle represents the profit per unit. If you want to think about it like that, that's this distance. So it's the price you receive as the monopolist minus the average total cost per unit that it takes to produce the unit. And then you multiply by the number of units you sell, which is this distance. And so then you color in this whole area, and that's going to be the monopolist's profit. Algebraically, that's going to be the price minus the average total cost. And remember, the average total cost, just to be clear, is going to be this point times the quantity produced. So now we have one more thing we'd like to look at, which is the welfare implications. As in, is the monopoly good or bad for total surplus? Well, the competitive equilibrium, or the one if no market power was present, would be where supply equals demand. For the monopolist, their supply curve is the marginal cost curve. So that would be this point. We'll call that QC for competitive. That's what the monopolist would produce if they didn't have any market power. And so at the competitive quantity, price would be lower. So price would be down here, and we'd produce more at a higher quantity. So if you remember how we calculate producer and consumer surplus, we find the difference between the demand curve and the price, and shade in all the area, and the supply curve and the price, in this case, the marginal cost curve, and shade in that area. So at the monopoly price, our surplus for the monopolist was all this area, right? This is a triangle. In this case, it's not a triangle because we have this weird edge on the right. So this is a monopolist surplus. And if we do the same for the consumers, we shade in the area between the demand curve and the price. This is consumer surplus. And what I want you to notice is if we had gone to the competitive quantity rather than the monopolist's profit maximizing quantity, we would have also shaded in these areas here, each one corresponding to consumer and monopolist surplus. And so this area that we just shaded in green, this is lost total surplus. This is surplus that wasn't realized because the monopolist had market power. So the monopolist has higher surplus under their profit maximizing quantity, but the total surplus of consumers and the monopolist is lower when we don't include this green triangle. This lost total surplus is also called deadweight loss. So in short, monopolist has market power. They restrict output and raise price. That raises their own surplus, and the consumers get less surplus. But as a society, we're a little bit worse off because there's this deadweight loss or unrealized surplus that exists because of the difference between the profit maximizing quantity and the competitive equilibrium. So that's it for monopoly. After this, we have one more market type, which we'll look at, which is going to be oligopoly.